Hi, this is Nathan Tintle. In this video, we're going to talk about how to compare variability between two or more distributions displayed in dot plots. We're going to use the Old Faithful data set from the Introduction to Statistical Investigations textbook. We see two dot plots here. In the top dot plot, we have the intereruption times for Old Faithful geyser after a long eruption. In this dot plot, we see that most of the observations are occurring between 65 and 95 minutes, meaning that after a long eruption, one that's lasted more than 3.5 minutes, Old Faithful typically takes between 65 and 95 minutes to erupt again. On the other hand, if we look at the bottom dot plot, after a short eruption, that is when Old Faithful erupts for less than 3.5 minutes, typically intereruption times vary between 40 and 65. So when we talk about variability, one way is to kind of talk about the range of the bulk of the data. Where's the bulk of the data? Notice that when we talked about this, we ignored a few unusual observations, but for the most part, we're just kind of saying, hey, most of the data is in this area. That's one way to talk about variability just by looking at a distribution. Another way is to use a computer or a calculator to compute the standard deviation. The standard deviation is a number that tells you on average, how far is the data away from the center, from the mean? The standard deviation is 8.5 minutes after a long eruption, 6.3 minutes after a short eruption. So this gives you a sense of how spread out is this data. What's interesting is while those numbers are somewhat comparable, the one's a little smaller than the other, if you compare it to the variability when the data is not separated, if you put all of these dots together, all 222 observations together, computed the standard deviation to be 12.8, the variability there would be much larger. A couple of cautions when we're talking about variability. It's better to focus on where the majority of the data is. Don't let a few unusual observations dramatically change the range that you report. And if you're going to talk about the standard deviation, remember that the standard deviation is the average deviation or distance of the values from the mean. In other words, how far is a typical value from the middle? Bigger standard deviations, more variability.